I was the one who gave the order to fire on him. I want that on the record before I tell you anything else, because everything I'm about to say, you should hear knowing that it comes from the being whose fault it was. I'm not a neutral witness. I am the reason it happened. My name is Sub-Commander Raask of the Khaad Ascendancy, and on the worst day of my life I gave the order to open fire on a single unarmed human diplomat, and in doing so I nearly ended my entire civilization. Let me tell you how a thing like that happens, not in the way the official record tells it, all clean lines and clear villains, the real way. The way these things actually happen, which is slowly and stupidly, with everyone involved certain they're doing the sensible thing right up until the floor drops out from under them. The station was called Meteran Reach. It was neutral ground, a treaty station, one of those places the great powers maintain in the empty spaces between their territories so they have somewhere to shout at each other without it being an act of war. It sat at the edge of the Khaad Ascendancy's frontier, where our space met the long, quiet gulf that separated us from the human sphere, and it had been there for 200 years, hosting the slow, grinding business of two empires that didn't trust each other and never would. I'd been posted there for 6 years, long enough to hate it. Long enough to be very, very bored, which is a dangerous thing for a soldier to be, because boredom makes you stupid, and stupid soldiers reach for their weapons when they should reach for their patience. You have to understand what a posting like Meteran Reach does to a warrior of an ascending empire. I had joined the military to conquer. That was the whole point, the thing every Khaad soldier dreamed of, to be part of the great climb, to plant the Ascendancy's banner on some new world, to come home with the honor that only victory could give. And instead I had been posted to a treaty station, a place whose entire purpose was the prevention of the very thing I trained for. 6 years of processing cargo manifests and standing ceremonial watch and watching diplomats from a dozen species exchange tedious courtesies in the neutral halls. 6 years of my warrior's edge going dull against the whetstone of pure tedium. I was rotting, and I knew I was rotting, and like any soldier rotting at a quiet post I had begun, without admitting it to myself, to want something to happen. Anything. A threat. A crisis. A reason to be the warrior I'd been made into instead of the clerk I'd become. That wanting is its own kind of danger, and no one warns you about it. A bored predator starts to see prey in shadows. It starts to hope the shadows are prey, because prey would mean the hunt, and the hunt would mean meaning. I didn't know, when the old human walked through my gate, that I had spent 6 years becoming exactly the kind of soldier who would shoot him. The boredom had been preparing me for years. He just happened to arrive on the day the trap I'd built inside myself was finally ready to spring. I should explain what the Khaad Ascendancy was, because the humans have their own version of us now, and it isn't flattering and it isn't entirely wrong. We were an empire on the way up. That's what ascendancy means. We were ascending, conquering, swallowing our region of the galaxy system by system with the hungry confidence of a young power that has never yet been beaten. We were good at war. We were proud of being good at war. Our whole culture was built around the warrior, the conqueror, the strong hand closing around the weak, and we measured every other species we met by a single question. Are they a threat or are they prey? We had met the humans only a handful of times, at the edges, in small, careful diplomatic contacts across that quiet gulf, and we had measured them, and we had filed them with the serene certainty of the never-beaten, under prey. That was the first mistake. It wasn't mine, it was made long before I ever stood my post on Meteran Reach, made in the strategy halls of the homeworld by beings far above my rank. But I inherited it, the way a soldier inherits everything, and I acted on it, and so it became mine too. Let me try to make you understand what it was like, being raised inside the certainty of an ascending empire, because if you don't understand the certainty, you'll think I was simply cruel, and it was worse than cruelty. It was faith. From the time I could walk, I was taught a single story about the universe, and the story was this: that the galaxy was a ladder, That strength was the only thing that decided who stood where on it, and that the Khaad were climbing, and that everything beneath us on the ladder existed either to be conquered or to be ignored. We had never lost. That was the proof of the story. 40 generations of conquest, system after system folding before us, and every victory was another stone in the foundation of our certainty. A people that has never lost does not believe it can lose. It cannot even imagine the shape of the thing that would beat it, because it has no memory to build the imagining from. I was good at my work, or I thought I was. I had risen to Sub-Commander young, on the strength of being exactly what the Ascendancy valued: decisive, aggressive, untroubled by the kind of hesitation our culture taught us to despise. We had a word for that hesitation, a word that was the worst insult one Khaad could give another. It translated, roughly, as pray-thinking. To pause, to doubt, to consider mercy, to wonder whether the weak thing in front of you might matter, that was pray-thinking, and a Khaad who showed it was halfway to being prey himself. I had built my whole identity on never showing it. I want you to hold that because it explains everything I did wrong. When the old human begged me to stop, when he showed me kindness and patience and restraint, every instinct my culture had drilled into me read those things as weakness, as prey-thinking, as the very contamination I'd spent my life avoiding. I was constitutionally incapable of seeing his restraint as strength. My whole civilization was. The humans had requested the meeting. That was unusual in itself. They'd asked for a formal diplomatic conference on Medarin Reach, neutral ground, to discuss what their message called an urgent matter of mutual survival. Our command read that phrase the way a predator reads the posturing of smaller prey, as a bluff, a desperate attempt by a weaker power to negotiate from a position of false strength. Mutual survival. As if the humans, with their handful of systems and their soft diplomatic contacts, were in any position to threaten the survival of the Khaad Ascendancy. Command agreed to the meeting mostly out of curiosity, and partly, I think, out of a desire to look the prey in the eye before we eventually got around to eating it. They sent one diplomat. One. That was the second thing that told us we were dealing with the weak. Every Khaad delegation traveled with an honor guard, advisors, the full weight of the Ascendancy made visible in bodies and steel. The humans sent a single man, on a single small unarmed ship, with no guard and no entourage and no visible weapons of any kind. He arrived at Medarin Reach alone, and walked through our security with his hands open and empty, and when our scanners swept him they found nothing. No weapon, no armor, no implant, nothing but an old man in a plain dark suit carrying a small case. I sat through the command briefing the day before he arrived, and I've thought about that briefing many times since, because everything we needed was in it, and we read all of it backwards. The human message hadn't just requested a meeting. It had carried a warning, phrased so plainly that our analysts dismissed it as crude. The humans had written that they were sending a representative of the highest gravity, that this representative must under no circumstances be threatened or detained, and that any act of violence against him would trigger consequences that humanity itself would be unable to recall or control. They had practically begged us in writing to handle him with care. And our command laughed at it. I remember the station commander, an old conqueror named Khaad Ascendancy, reading the warning aloud to the assembled officers in a tone of pure contempt. Consequences humanity itself could not control. He read it the way you'd read a child's threat. To a Khaad, a warning like that was not a warning at all, it was an admission of weakness. A strong power does not warn. A strong power acts. If the humans truly had the capacity to harm us, Sethar reasoned they would simply have done it or threatened it openly from a position of strength. The fact that they were pleading with us to be careful, that they were so anxious about the safety of their single old diplomat, proved that he was precious to them, fragile, a soft point we could press if we ever needed leverage. We read their desperation to protect him as proof that he was a weakness when it was the exact opposite. They weren't trying to protect him from us. They were trying to protect us from him, from what he carried, from what would happen if he died on our hands. And we, in our certainty, heard only prey begging for its life, and filed the most important warning in our history under bluff. His name was Elias Vossembeke. He gave it to me himself at the security gate because I was the officer of the watch that day and it fell to me to process his entry. He was old, by human standards gray, lined, moving with the unhurried care of age. He had kind eyes. I remember that specifically because it annoyed me at the time. I'd expected fear or arrogance or the brittle false confidence of a weak creature trying to seem strong. Instead, this old human looked at me, the armored officer of an empire that had filed his species under prey, and his eyes were kind and a little sad, the way you'd look at someone you knew was about to make a terrible mistake and couldn't stop. "Sub-Commander Raask," he said, reading my insignia. His translator rendered his voice gently. "Thank you for processing me personally. I know it's beneath your rank. I appreciate it anyway." I didn't answer. You don't make conversation with prey. I waved him through and I logged his entry and I thought no more about it, except for the eyes, which stayed with me the way a small stone stays in your boot. I want to tell you about the title, because it's the thing the whole disaster turned on, and we got it wrong, and the getting it wrong is the entire story. Elias Vossembeke's formal title in the human diplomatic service translated into our language as something like Senior Ambassador. That's how our intelligence had it. That's how command briefed us. A senior ambassador, an important diplomat, yes, but a diplomat, a talker, a soft creature whose only weapons were words. But that translation was wrong. It was wrong in a way that should have been caught. That would have been caught if anyone in our command had bothered to read past the surface of the human language. Instead of assuming, they already understood a species they'd filed under prey. Because the human term for what Vossembeke actually was did not mean senior ambassador. It meant something much older and much stranger, a term the humans had brought with them out of their own long violent history, and the nearest our language could come to it, once we finally understood, was not ambassador at all. It was closer to the one who carries the end. I'll tell you the full shape of it now, even though I didn't learn it until later, because you'll watch the rest of this story differently if you understand what he actually was. The humans, in their long and bloody history, had learned a lesson that the Khaad never had because the Khaad had never lost. The humans had lost, over and over. They had spent their whole history on the edge of self-destruction, had come within a breath of ending themselves more than once, with weapons terrible enough to unmake their own world. And out of that history, they had built a strange and solemn institution. They had decided that the most terrible powers a people could hold should never be controlled by warriors, or by the proud, or by anyone hungry to use them. They should be carried instead by a single person whose entire training, whose entire being was devoted to one purpose, to make sure those powers were never used. A person who held the end in their hands precisely so they could keep choosing, every day, not to let it fall. Vossembeke was that. Among humans, the role was ancient and rare and chosen with enormous care, and the beings who held it were not diplomats in any sense we understood. They were the living safeguards on humanity's deadliest capabilities, the hand on the leash of forces that could end worlds, selected not for strength or cunning, but for the one quality the Khaad most despised, the bottomless, disciplined, unbreakable commitment to restraint, to carry the end and never use it, to be, in their own grim human phrase, the thing that stands between. We attacked the one being in the galaxy whose entire life was devoted to making sure the terrible thing never happened. We attacked the safety catch, thinking it was the gun. And in doing so, we did the one thing the safety catch existed to prevent. We put our hands on the trigger of something we did not understand and could not survive, and we squeezed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. On the day he arrived, he was just an old man with kind eyes and a small case, and I was a bored sub-commander on a station at the edge of nowhere, and neither of us knew yet that I was about to give the order that would teach the Khaad Ascendancy the difference between prey and patience. The meeting was scheduled for the following day. Sembeki was given quarters in the neutral section of the station, and he spent the evening, by all accounts, quietly, reading and walking the observation decks and looking out at the stars of the gulf between our peoples. He bothered no one. He made no demands. One of the station staff, a low-caste servitor whose job was to bring meals to the diplomatic quarters, told me later that the old human had thanked her by name, had asked about her family, had treated her, a servitor, the lowest thing on that station, with a courtesy that confused her so badly she didn't know how to respond. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I think about it constantly now. The way a being treats the powerless tells you everything about what they are, and we had a man on our station who treated the powerless with tenderness, and we read it as weakness, when it was the exact opposite. It was the tenderness of someone who knew, better than anyone alive, what it cost when tenderness failed. That servitor, her name was Yell, and she was of a conquered species, the lowest caste we had, the kind of being a Khaad officer would step over without seeing. She told me the rest of it later after everything, when there was no longer any reason to lie. She said the old human had asked her to sit with him for a moment, that first evening, while he ate. That no one in her entire life had ever asked her to sit. She said he'd looked out at the stars and asked her quietly whether she was happy on the station, and that when she didn't know how to answer such an impossible question, he'd nodded as though her silence was answer enough, and he'd said something she didn't understand at the time. He'd said, "I hope your people remember that you were kind after all this is over. Kindness is the only thing that survives an ending. I've seen a great many endings. It's the only thing that ever survives." She thought he was a strange, sad old man. She didn't know she was talking to the most dangerous being who had ever set foot on Meteran Reach. Neither did I. That was the whole problem. We were a people who could recognize a warrior across a battlefield at 1,000 paces, and we could not recognize the thing in front of us at all, because we had no category for it, because we had filed his entire species under prey, and there is no prey-shaped box that the truth of him could fit inside. The trouble started the next morning, and it started because of me, and it started over something so small that I'm ashamed to say it. A weapon went missing from the station armory, a single sidearm during an inventory. It almost certainly had nothing to do with the human. It turned up days later, misplaced by a careless quartermaster, exactly the kind of dull mistake that accounts for nearly all apparent mysteries. But that morning, with the human delegation on the station and tensions running high and my own boredom curdling into the particular paranoid alertness of a soldier who wants something to happen, I made a connection that wasn't there. A weapon missing, a human alone on the station, a species we'd filed under prey, requesting a meeting about mutual survival, which we'd already decided was a bluff. My mind assembled these pieces into a picture, and the picture was assassination. The human had come not to negotiate but to kill. The single unarmed diplomat was a cover, a distraction, while some human scheme moved in the dark. It was nonsense. I know that now. I half knew it then, the way you half know the thing you've decided to do anyway. But I was a sub-commander of the Khaad Ascendancy, raised on the certainty that the strong act and the weak hesitate, and I had convinced myself that hesitating was the dangerous choice. So I did the thing my whole culture had trained me to do. I moved against the threat. I gathered a security detail, 6 of my best, armed and armored, and I went to the human's quarters to detain him, and if he resisted, to deal with him as the Ascendancy dealt with threats. I want to be honest about what was happening inside me on that walk to his quarters, because it's the part I understand least and have thought about most. I was afraid. Not of the human. I didn't believe, not really, that one old man was a physical threat. I was afraid of being wrong in the other direction. I was afraid that if I did nothing, and the human turned out to be a threat, I would be the sub-commander who hesitated, who showed pre-thinking, who let the ascendancy be harmed because he was too soft to act. That fear was louder than my judgment. My judgment was whispering that this was foolish, that the missing weapon was nothing, that an old man who walked through our security with open hands was not an assassin. But my judgment whispered and my fear shouted, and I had been raised in a culture that had taught me, all my life, to trust the shout and despise the whisper. So I walked, and my hand was steady, and underneath the steadiness something in me already knew I was making the worst mistake of my life and could not make myself stop. That is how atrocities happen, by the way. I've had a long time to think about it, not through hatred, through fear of being seen to hesitate in a culture that has made hesitation the only unforgivable sin. The cruelest things I have ever witnessed were done by frightened people who were more afraid of looking weak than of doing wrong. I was one of them. I walked to that old man's door afraid of the wrong thing, and I have never stopped paying for it. He didn't resist. That's the thing I have to live with. When my detail breached his door, Elias Vosembeki was sitting quietly with his small case on the table in front of him, and he looked up at 6 armed Khaad soldiers pointing weapons at an unarmed old man, and he did not flinch, and he did not beg, and he did not reach for anything. He just looked at us with those kind, sad eyes, and he said, very gently, the thing that should have stopped me, the thing I have replayed 10,000 times since. "Please don't," he said. "Not because of what you think will happen to me, because of what will happen to you. I'm begging you, Sub-Commander. Stand your men down and let me explain what I am before you do something that can't be taken back." I came a very long way to prevent exactly this. There was a moment then. I want to tell you about the moment because it is the hinge of my entire life, the place where everything could still have gone differently and didn't. He had not moved. His hands were on the table where I could see them. The small case sat closed in front of him. And something in his voice, not fear, that was the thing, there was no fear in it at all, only a terrible patient sorrow. Something in his voice reached the part of me that my culture had spent a lifetime teaching me to ignore. The whisper, the judgment. For one breath I stood in that doorway and the whisper said, clearly, he is not lying. Whatever he is not lying and you should listen. For one breath I almost lowered my weapon. And then one of my soldiers, young and frightened, shifted his grip on his weapon, and the small movement broke the moment, and I felt the eyes of my detail on me. 6 soldiers waiting to see whether their sub-commander would act or hesitate, and the old terror rose up, the terror of being seen to show pre-thinking, of being the one who flinched, and it drowned the whisper the way it had drowned the whisper my whole life. I could not be the one who hesitated, not in front of my men. Not in a culture where hesitation was the only unforgivable sin. And I proud, bored, certain, stupid, I heard a weak creature pleading for its life. I heard pray. I gave the order. We fired on Elias Vosembeki, lone human diplomat, unarmed in his quarters on Meteran Reach. And that is the moment the Khaad Ascendancy began to die. Not because of what the bullets did to him, because of what they woke. But I'm getting ahead of myself again, and I keep doing that, because part of me still doesn't want to arrive at what came next. Let me slow down. Let me tell you what happened in the seconds after we fired, when the old man with the kind eyes did the thing none of us expected, the thing that wasn't a weapon and wasn't a defense, and was somehow more terrifying than either. Let me tell you what it means that his title was not ambassador, but the one who carries the end. And why, when I gave the order to fire, the first thing he did was not die and not fight but weep. The bullets hit him, and he didn't die, and that was the first thing that was wrong. I don't mean he was armored. I told you our scanners found nothing, no plate, no field, no implant. I mean the bullets hit him, 3 of them, center mass, the way my soldiers were trained to fire, and Elias Vosembeki rocked back in his chair, and a dark stain spread across his plain dark suit, and he should have died. An old man takes 3 rounds and he dies. That is how the universe works. And he didn't. He sat there, bleeding, breathing in a slow, ragged way, and he lifted his head and looked at me, and his eyes were wet. And I realized with a lurch of pure animal wrongness that the old human was not afraid and not angry. He was grieving. He was sitting there with 3 holes in him, and he was grieving, and it was not himself he was grieving for. It was us. "Oh," he said, "just that. Oh, you poor fools, you actually did it." And then he wept, openly, the tears running down into the lines of his ancient face, and through the weeping he kept talking, fast now, urgent, the way a man talks when he's racing something he knows he's already lost to. "Listen to me. Listen. You have to listen now, because I cannot stop it once it finishes, and it has already started. It started the moment my heart took the damage, and we have minutes, do you understand? We have minutes, and then it cannot be undone." I didn't understand. None of us understood. My soldiers had their weapons still raised, frozen, because a bleeding enemy weeping and giving urgent instructions is not a thing any training prepares you for. I should have fired again. Some part of me knew, even then, that the right move by every doctrine I'd ever learned was to put him down completely and silence whatever this was. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because the thing in his voice had finally reached the part of me that had been whispering all along, and the whisper had become a scream, and the scream said, he was telling the truth. He was telling the truth about all of it. The room had gone strange. I want to try to describe it, because it was the kind of strangeness that comes when the ground of your reality shifts under you. My soldiers, hardened Khaad, conquerors, beings who had killed before and felt nothing, stood frozen, and I could see in their faces the same thing breaking that was breaking in me. One of them, the young one whose shifted grip had broken the moment in the doorway, had started to shake. The station's alert systems were beginning to register the discharge of weapons in a diplomatic quarter. Somewhere far off I could hear the rising tone of an alarm and the heavy tread of more security responding. And under all of it, beneath the alarm and the alert and the old man's ragged breathing, there was something else. A pressure. I felt it before I could name it, the way you feel a storm coming in the joints of an old wound. Something vast was gathering. Something that had been sleeping was waking up, far away and getting closer. And every instinct older than my culture, the deep animal instinct that no amount of conqueror's pride can fully kill, was telling me to run, that a predator infinitely beyond me had just opened its eyes. "What did we do?" I said. My own voice sounded far away. "What did we wake?" And he told me. Bleeding, dying, weeping, in the few minutes we had, Elias Vos Sembeki told me what he was and what I had done. And I am going to tell it to you the way he told it to me, because there is no better way. "My title," he said, "the one your people translated as ambassador. It doesn't mean ambassador. We don't send ambassadors to powers like yours. There's no point. You don't negotiate, you only conquer. Everyone in the galaxy knows it. We send ambassadors to peoples we can talk to peoples like yours, the ascending ones, the never-beaten ones, the ones who file everyone else under prey. To you, we send something else. We send one of us." He coughed, and there was dark blood in it. Humanity learned a long time ago, on our own world in our own wars, that the most dangerous power a people can hold is the power to end things completely. And we learned that such a power can never, ever be trusted to anyone who wants to use it. So we built a tradition. We built a role. We take that power, the absolute power, the ending, and we put it in the hands of a single person, and we train that person their whole life for one thing only. Not to use it, to carry it, to stand between the ending and the world, and to keep choosing every single day not to let it fall. We call them many things. The plainest is the one your tongue almost got right, the one who carries the end. "You're a weapon," I said. "No." His wet eyes found mine, and there was something fierce in them now under the grief. "That's exactly what you'd think, and it's exactly wrong, and the wrongness is the whole tragedy. A weapon is a thing that's meant to be fired. I am the opposite. I am the thing that exists so the weapon is never fired. I carry the ending so that no one who wants to use it ever can. Do you see?" The power humanity gave me, the thing inside me, the thing your bullets just triggered, it is the deadliest force my species has ever built. And I was chosen to carry it for one reason, the only reason a person is ever chosen for this. Because I would rather die than use it. Because every keeper of the end, going back through our whole history, has been someone who would let themselves be killed 1,000 times before they would let the ending fall. That is the only kind of person you can trust with it. The kind who weeps when it's triggered. The kind who is, right now, with the last minutes of his life, trying to save the people who just murdered him. He told me in those minutes more than I think he meant to, the way the dying do. He told me what it had cost him to be what he was, 60 years. He had been chosen as a young man, he said, and trained for 60 years. And for all 60 years he had carried the ending inside himself, awake and asleep, every single day choosing to hold it. He had never married, keepers did not, could not, because the role asked a kind of solitude most beings could not survive. He had never fought a war, never fired a weapon, never raised his hand against another living thing in 6 decades, because the discipline of the keeper was total. A being trusted with the end of worlds could not be permitted even the smallest taste of violence, lest it wear a groove. He had spent 60 years being the most powerful person in human space and the gentlest, and the two were not a contradiction, they were the same fact, because the power was only safe in hands that had been made gentle on purpose, deliberately, across a whole lifetime of refusing. They think it's a burden, he murmured, half to himself now. The young ones, when they're first chosen, they think it will be heavy, and it is, but not the way they expect. The weight isn't the ending, the weight is the choosing. 60 years of mornings waking up and the first thing before anything else, the first thing every day, choosing again not to let it fall. That's the weight, not the power, the choice. Over and over forever until the day you die. His eyes came back to me. And I would have done it for 60 more. I wanted to. I was good at it. And you took it from me with 3 bullets because you couldn't tell the strongest thing in the galaxy from the weakest. I'm not angry, Sub-Commander. I'm just so terribly sad. We came such a long way to keep this from happening to all of us. I have never before or since felt the thing I felt in that moment. It was the feeling of the entire foundation of my world cracking all at once, everything I had been taught, the ladder, the strong and the weak, prey and threat. I had been raised to believe that strength was the capacity for violence, and here was a dying old man explaining to me that the greatest power in the galaxy belonged precisely to the one being most committed to never using it, and that we had attacked him exactly because we couldn't tell the difference. We had looked at the safest hands in the universe, hands chosen across 100 generations for the single quality of restraint, and seen only weakness, and shot them. And the worst of it, the part that made me want to be sick right there on the floor of that quarter, was understanding what it said about us. Not about the humans, about the Khaad. We had built a whole civilization on the certainty that the powerful take and the weak yield, and that certainty had made us unable to even perceive a different kind of power when it stood in front of us with open hands and warned us, in writing, to be careful. The humans had sent us the one being designed to be unmistakable as a threat, a person carrying the literal end of worlds, and we had been so deep inside our own story that we'd seen a soft old man and filed him under prey. Our certainty hadn't just made us cruel, it had made us blind, and blindness in a people holding as much power as we held is the most dangerous thing in the universe. We were a knife that could not see what it was cutting. We had been one for 40 generations, and no one had ever been strong enough to stop us, because everyone we met was either conquered or afraid. The humans weren't afraid. That was the thing I finally understood, kneeling in that room. They weren't afraid of us, and they never had been, and the warning they'd sent hadn't been the plea of the weak. It had been the last mercy of the strong, a strong people trying, one final time, to keep a blind and dangerous child from cutting itself on something it didn't understand. And the child had cut anyway. "What did the bullets trigger?" I said. "Tell me what's coming." "A dead man response," Vosembiki said. "It's bound to me, to my heart, my life." The keeper of the end carries the ending inside himself, and the ending is held back by one thing only, the keeper being alive and choosing moment to hold it. That's the design. That's the whole genius and horror of it. The power cannot be seized because the moment anyone tries to take it by force, the moment the keeper is killed, it releases. It is the one weapon in the galaxy that punishes its own use. You cannot win it. You cannot capture it. You cannot kill the keeper and take the ending because killing the keeper is the ending. We built it that way on purpose so that no conqueror ever could do exactly what you just did and profit from it. He was fading now. I could see it. You killed the only thing holding it back, me. And now it's coming, and I have spent my whole life learning to hold it, and I cannot hold it from the other side of death. Then stop it, I said. I was begging now. The proud sub-commander of the never-beaten Khaad begging a dying human. You said minutes. You said it could be undone. Tell me how. Tell me what to do. And here is the thing that I think is the truest thing in this whole story. The thing that tells you what humanity actually is. Underneath the title and the power and the terrible ending bound to one old man's heart. Because Elias Vosembiki, with the last minutes of his life, dying of wounds I had given him, betrayed by the very people he'd crossed the gulf to save, he did not curse me. He did not let the ending fall in vengeance, though he could have, though by every law of justice he had every right. He looked at me, the being who had murdered him, and he spent his dying breath trying to save my world. There's a way, he said. There's always a way. We built one in because we are not monsters. We always leave a door. The dead man response can be recalled, but only by the keeper. Only by me with my own authority, my own voice, my own living will, and only before my heart stops. That's the door. That's the only door. While I'm alive, I can still call it back. The moment I die, the door closes and the ending falls, and your civilization joins the long list of the ones that learned too late. His hand moved toward the small case on the table. Help me. I cannot reach it. Help me reach the case and help me stay alive long enough to speak the recall, and I will save your people, Sub-Commander. I will spend the death you gave me buying back the world you nearly ended. But you have to help me. You have to choose, right now, to help the dying enemy you were so certain was prey. And my soldiers looked at me. 6 of them, weapons still half raised, every instinct of our culture screaming that this was a trick, that you do not help the enemy, that a Khaad does not lower his weapon and kneel to save the very creature he was sent to destroy. To do what the human asked was the deepest prey-thinking imaginable. It was everything I had been taught to despise. It was weakness, surrender, the abandonment of every principle the Ascendancy had built me on. I dropped my weapon. I crossed the room, and I knelt beside the dying old man who was trying to save my world, and I took his weight against me, and I helped him reach the case, because somewhere in the last few minutes the whisper had won, finally and completely, and the whisper was the only part of me that had ever been right. Thank you, Vosembiki breathed. Thank you. There may be hope for you yet. There's always, he coughed terribly, there's always hope for the ones who can still change their minds. The case, when I helped him open it, was not what I expected. I had braced myself in some animal part of me for a weapon, for the deadliest force humanity had ever built to look like something, to gleam, to hum with menace. It didn't. Inside the case, nested in plain gray padding, there was only a small device, matte and unremarkable about the size of my fist, with a single worn surface where a thumb had clearly rested 10,000 times over 60 years. That was all. The end of worlds, and it looked like a thing an old man had carried in his pocket his whole life and rubbed smooth with worry. There was no display, no array of controls, nothing that announced its power. Just the smooth-worn place where Elias Vosembiki had touched it every morning, choosing. It's bound to me, he said, seeing my face. To my voice print, my living will, the pattern of a mind that spent 60 years learning to hold this. No one else can use it. No one else can recall it. That's the design. It answers only to a keeper, and only while the keeper lives. which means I have to do this myself, and I have to do it now. Before he pressed his hand to the wound in his chest, and his face went gray, before my heart makes the decision for both of us. He put his thumb on the worn place. His hand was shaking so badly I had to close my own hand over his to steady it, the hand of the killer steadying the hand of the keeper, and I felt the small device grow warm under our joined fingers, and Ascendancy drew a breath that rattled in his ruined chest, and began, in a failing voice, to speak the recall. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because helping him reach the case was only the beginning, and what came next was a race, the most desperate race of my life, a dying man and the soldier who'd killed him, working together against the clock of his own failing heart, while the ending he carried gathered itself in the dark and his blood ran out between my hands. Let me tell you what the recall cost him, and the terrible choice that came at the very end, when his heart began to fail in the middle of it, the choice that taught me, far too late, what it actually means to be strong. The recall was not a button. I think I'd expected a button. Some single act, a code spoken, a switch thrown, and the ending called back into its sleep. It wasn't like that. The recall was a thing Ascendancy had to do, with his mind and his will and his failing voice, and it took time we did not have, and it cost him in a way I didn't understand until I watched it happen. He spoke into the small, worn device, and what he spoke was not a command. It was a kind of declaration, long and precise in the human tongue, his voice failing and steadying and failing again. The translator caught fragments. He was naming himself. His full name, his lineage of keepers, the authority passed to him, the oath he had taken 60 years before. He was, I understood slowly, reasserting himself as the living will that held the ending back, telling the thing he carried, in the language it was built to obey, that the keeper still lived, that the keeper still chose, that the release was countermanded by the only authority that could countermand it. He was holding the door open with his own dying mind, and the door was very heavy, and he was very nearly gone. "It's resisting," he gasped between passages. "It thinks I'm dead." The trigger fired, it felt my heart take the wound, and now I have to convince it, I have to prove I'm still here, still choosing. And it is very hard to prove you're alive when you're not sure yourself. He broke off, coughing, and more dark blood came, and his eyes lost focus for a terrible second before he dragged them back. "Stay with me, Sub-Commander. Talk to me. Keep me here. The recall needs a living mind, and mine keeps trying to leave." So I talked to him. I, who had filed his species under prey, who had given the order, who had 3 of my soldiers' bullets in his chest. I knelt on that floor with his blood soaking into my armor, and I talked to the dying human to keep him alive, because his living was now the only thing standing between my civilization and the dark. I told him about the gulf between our peoples, the stars I'd watched from this station for 6 years. I told him about Yell, the servitor he'd asked to sit with him, because I knew he'd remember her, and remembering is a kind of staying. I told him at the end the truest thing I had, which was that I was sorry, that I had been wrong, that I had spent my whole life believing a story about strength that he had just shattered with 3 bullets in his chest, and a refusal to use the end of worlds even on the people who'd put them there. My soldiers helped in the end. That's a thing I never forget. These were hardened Khaad, conquerors, beings raised on the same story I was, and they had just watched their sub-commander drop his weapon and kneel to an enemy, and by every rule of our culture they should have stopped me, should have finished the human, should have reported me for the deepest prey-thinking imaginable. Instead, one of them, the young one, the one who'd been shaking, knelt down beside me and pressed his own hands over the wounds in the old man's chest, trying to slow the bleeding, his armored fingers clumsy and desperate. And then another knelt, and another. 6 Khaad soldiers on their knees around a dying human, all of them trying with everything they had to keep alive the enemy they'd come to kill, because something in that room had reached past 40 generations of conquest and touched the thing underneath, the thing the old story had buried but never quite killed. We were not only what we had been taught to be. None of us are. That was part of what he showed us, just by dying the way he did. "I know," he whispered when I told him I was sorry. "I know you're sorry, that's why there's hope. Keep talking, almost there." And then his heart began to fail. I felt it before he said it because I was holding him, and I felt the change come over his body, the slackening, the cold. The recall was not finished. He had spoken most of it, asserted most of himself, but there was a final part, a last ceiling, and his heart was going to stop before he reached it. I could see the knowledge in his face. He had moments, fewer than he needed, and the ending he carried, half convinced its keeper still lived, hung in the balance, and if his heart stopped before the recall sealed, it would take the doubt as proof, and the door would close, and the dark would fall on the Khaad Ascendancy after all. Here is the choice he made. Here is the thing that taught me what strength is, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to be worthy of having witnessed it. There was a way to finish in time. He told me in broken pieces, his voice almost gone. The recall could be sealed faster, but only by spending the last of himself all at once, by pouring every remaining moment of his life into the final sealing in a single burst, instead of letting his heart fade slowly toward its natural stop. It would not save him either way. He was dying, that was certain. But the slow death might let him linger a few more minutes, minutes of being alive, of breath and light and my voice and the stars out the viewport. And the fast death, the spending, would end him now, immediately, would pour those last minutes into the recall and gutter him out like a candle pinched between two fingers. He could have the minutes, or he could have the seal. He could not have both. He didn't hesitate, that's the thing. I had spent my whole life in a culture that prized the warrior who doesn't hesitate, and I had never once seen it, not really, not the true thing, until I watched a dying old human, given the choice between a few more minutes of his own precious life and the survival of the people who had murdered him, choose without a flicker. He pressed his thumb hard against the worn place on the device. He looked at me, and he smiled, and there were tears on his face, but the smile was real, and he said the last thing he ever said, which I have carried every day since and will carry until I die. He said, "This is what it's for, the whole 60 years, it was all for this one choice. Tell your people," and his voice was almost nothing now, a breath shaped into words, "tell them the strong are the ones who don't. Remember that. The strong are the ones who don't." And then he spent himself. I felt it go out of him all at once, the last of his life pouring into the small, worn device, and the device sealed, and somewhere far off in the dark, the thing that had been gathering, the ending, the deadliest force humanity ever built, felt its keeper assert himself one final time with the very last of what he had, and believed him, and went back to sleep. The pressure I'd felt in the room, the storm in my old wound, the sense of a vast predator opening its eyes, it released. It drained out of the air. The dark closed its eyes again and slept. And Elias Vosembiki died in my arms, a being I had killed, having spent his death to save my world. I held him for a long time. My soldiers didn't speak. The alarms had gone quiet. The station went on around us, oblivious, never knowing how close it had come, how close all of us had come, to an ending that one old man had held back twice, once with 60 years of choosing, and once, finally, with the spending of his own death. I'm going to tell you what happened to the Khaad Ascendancy, because that's the part the title promises, though it isn't really the point. We didn't fall. The ending was recalled, no world burned, but something fell anyway that day, something more important than a civilization, and it fell inside me first and then spread. I made the record, the full one. I didn't hide my part. You've heard me name it, again and again, because the naming is the only penance available to a man who did what I did. I brought the truth to my command, to Commander Sethar who had laughed at the human warning, to the strategy halls of the homeworld where they'd filed humanity under prey. I made them listen to what Vosembiki was, and what he'd done, and what his last words were. And I watched the same thing crack in them that had cracked in me, the foundation, the certainty, the whole proud story of the latter. Because you cannot hear that story and go on believing that strength is the capacity for violence. You cannot. The most powerful being any of us had ever encountered had proven with his life that the deepest strength is the refusal, the restraint, the choosing not to, and that a civilization which cannot tell that strength from weakness is not strong at all. It is just dangerous. It is just a blind knife. The ascendancy stopped ascending. Not all at once. Empires don't turn on a single day, but it began that day to become something else. We are still becoming it. It is slow and it is hard, and there are many among my people who fight it, who want the old story back, the comfortable story where we are the strong and everyone else is prey. But there are more of us now who have heard the truth, who know what an old human spent his death to teach us. We sent envoys to the human sphere, real ones, humble ones, to apologize, to learn, to ask how a people builds a tradition like the Keepers, a tradition that puts its deadliest power in the hands of the one most committed never to use it. The humans received us with a wariness we had earned and a grace we had not, and they have been, slowly, teaching us. I want to tell you one more thing about the humans, because it surprised me more than anything else, and it changed how I understood the whole encounter. When our envoys finally reached the human sphere and the truth came out that a keeper had died, that the ascendancy had attacked the one who carries the end, I expected vengeance. I expected that humanity, having lost one of its most precious people to our blindness, would finally show us the violence we'd always assumed lurked behind their soft diplomacy. They had every reason, they had every right, and they had, as we now knew, the means. They didn't. They grieved Ascendancy, grieved him deeply. He had been beloved, it turned out, a man whose gentleness was famous across human space, and then they did the thing that finally, completely broke the old story in me. They sent us a new keeper, not as a threat, as a teacher. They sent one of their most precious people, one of the carriers of their end, back across the same gulf, to the same kind of meeting, trusting us again with the very thing we had murdered, because they understood something we were only beginning to learn, that the way you break the cycle of blindness and violence is not with more violence. It is by refusing against all reason to stop offering the trust, by being, even to the people who killed your best, the strong ones, the ones who don't. I met that second keeper. I won't tell you her name. She asked me not to, and I owe the keepers my silences now. But I will tell you that I wept when I saw her walk through the same gate Ascendancy had walked through, with the same open, empty hands, carrying the same terrible, gentle power, trusting the same people who had failed so catastrophically the first time. And I will tell you that this time, we got it right. This time, no one fired. This time, an ascending empire that was learning not to ascend looked at the strongest being in the galaxy and finally saw her for what she was. I left the military. I keep a different kind of post now. I tend the memory of Elias Ascendancy. I have made it my life's work, the way he made the holding of the end his, traveling between worlds telling this story, the true one, the one where I am the villain and the prey was the strongest being in the galaxy. I tell it to young Khaad especially, the ones being raised on the old story, the ones who still believe that hesitation is the only sin. I tell them about the whisper and the shout. I tell them about the man who wept when we shot him, and spent his death to save us, and smiled at the end. And I tell them his last words every time, because they are the whole of what he died to teach, and because a galaxy full of ascending empires needs to hear them more than it needs almost anything else. The strong are the ones who don't. They attacked a lone human diplomat, certain he was prey, and they were right that he was death itself, but not the way they thought. He wasn't death because he could kill. He was death because he carried the end of worlds and chose, every single morning for 60 years and one last time with his dying breath, not to let it fall. That was the power. That was the thing we couldn't see. The deadliest force in the galaxy, in the gentlest hands that were ever made, kept gentle on purpose, so that the end would never come. We met death itself on a station at the edge of nowhere, and death wept for us and saved us, and asked only that we remember the strong are the ones who don't. I remember, I will remember until I die. And I am trying, with whatever is left of me, to be worthy of the lesson a man I murdered spent his last breath to teach.